Sports Talk Chicago here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. She's the sports editor at the San Francisco Chronicle and a BBWA member. Please welcome Christina Kahrl to the program. Christina, great to have you on again. How are you?
Pretty good about you, John.
I'm doing great. Thanks for being here. Happy holidays. What do you make of your Hall of Fame ballot to start today?
Well, it's going to be an interesting one, of course, because several people are in their 10th and last year with Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Sammy Sosa, and Kurt Schilling, all there at the top of the ballot for people who are wondering about what to do before they slip away off into era committee land. And whenever the era committees elect to pick up their cases. But in the meantime, it's last chance sweepstakes for those four in particular. And then, of course, Jeff Kent is in his ninth year. So he's also on short time. If he's going to get a bounce, like we've seen in some previous candidates who get that great number, like year 9 bounce that suggests they're going to make it in the 10th year. I think Larry Walker and Edgar Martinez, among recent inductees, are those who have definitely gotten that boost. And so we'll see if Jeff Kent is one of those guys who gets that in their next to last year. So it's definitely going to be an interesting year to watch as far as where voters wind up, not just on PEDs, not just on Kurt Schilling's saying stuff publicly, but just in general where this puts the Hall of Fame in the years to come.
You mentioned Jeff Kent's case. I'm a pretty big proponent of his as well. Best power hitting second baseman in baseball history. Where do you stand on his case, and where have you voted for him in the past?
I have not voted for Jeff Kent in the past. However, this is a tough year. I mean, it's a crowded ballot. I know that if he is still on the ballot next year, year 10, I'm going to be voting for him. This year, it's a little tough about whether or not I'm going to vote for him. But yeah, I definitely think he is ultimately a Hall of Famer that we need to get into. I think, again, between the power and his contribution to so many important teams and significant teams in that period, a lot of teams that contended, thanks to Jeff Kent, really only had one below average year in his entire career, and even that was pretty average. So, this guy did not have a tail. This is not like a bad end of his career or a long ramp up or anything. He was just excellent from the get-go. And, again, such an important part of so many competitive teams that because of the slugging, because of the ability to get on base, hit for average. I mean, he really was, and although his defense was not exceptional, in any stretch, and was a weakness, he did not have a ton of range. But we've seen other defense challenged candidates, get in recent years, who definitely have a stronger hitting side of their resume for the Hall. And that's where, look at Derek Jeter, one of the greatest middle infielders of all time. Has nothing to do with whether or not you think he was a great defensive shortstop. It has everything to do with he was a key element of so many contending teams. And the fact that he did not, necessarily wow people with his defensive metrics, not really relevant. Derek Jeter, Hall of Famer. Jeff Kent, same thing, does not wow people with his defensive metrics, but ultimately belongs in the Hall of Fame.
Let me ask you this. When you look at this ballot this year, do you find anybody who's a slam dunk Hall of Famer, somebody you really think should be there right now that probably isn't?
But probably isn't? That's a tough one. See, that's where I would say, a guy who I think is a Hall of Famer, who probably is. I mean, I think Gary Sheffield is a slam dunk Hall of Famer. He should be in the Hall. You look at the 90s and the early oddies, and if you needed a slugger and you wanted to win it all, Gary Sheffield was the guy you went out and got. I think it was Bill James who pointed out, in his time at the Red Sox, the guy they were more afraid of on the opposing teams and all of his, year after year, the guy they were worried about when he was with the Yankees or wherever was Gary Sheffield, because Gary Sheffield really was that good. And when you look at the hitting resume, it's not even close. He's a Hall of Fame right fielder. It's whether or not you believe the output of today's defensive metrics, or, and whether or not you hold against him, the fact that, no, he was not a good shortstop. No, he was not a good third baseman. He was a good enough third baseman that the Marlins could certainly win a title with him. But, ultimately, like alternating him between third base and right field. And when they were playing him at third base and had Darren Dalton in right field because they were just trying to cram another bat. It's like, okay, Gary Sheffield was legitimately a defensive replacement for Dutch in right field, no doubt about it, because Dutch was terrible out in right. But again, they were looking to get as much offense as they could on the field. Jack McKeon was a genius at it. And really, I think the oddity or the tough thing with Sheffield is that because he moved around so much, that he doesn't have a natural constituency among the voters. It's not like you've got a huge BBWAA chapter down in Miami that is like relishing the chance of putting Gary Sheffield in their Hall of Fame, since he was, again, only a Marlin for a short period of time. But ultimately, I just think of it, it's really kind of silly that we haven't already said, yeah, Gary Sheffield is in the Hall of Fame. But again, you end up with a little bit of concern about like his being named in the Mitchell Report and Balco and all of that. And, in Sheffield, as he said at the time, was like, yeah, he didn't feel it like did him any good. It's certainly, there isn't a huge part of his resume as a hitter if you were going to try like Dan Zimborski to try to break down like, ooh, how much benefit did he get from potentially using PEDs? Well, Sheffield said he didn't get much of a benefit and didn't use them for long. And on top of that, he doesn't have that huge spike in the way that like makes people suspicious, in the way that whether you want to talk about Sammy Sosa or you want to talk about Barry Bonds, he doesn't have that. And so he's just Gary Sheffield through his career, and is amazing. And it's kind of silly that he isn't already in or doesn't get more support.
Where do you stand on steroid use personally when it comes to players in the Hall of Fame?
I vote for steroid users. I think that they are, again, they shouldn't be discounted. They are an intrinsic part of the history of the game. We are not going to forget who was named in the Mitchell Report. We are not going to forget who was caught in Balco or any of the other scandals revolving PEDs. We're not going to forget, like Ryan Braun lying to everybody on national television. Or we're not going to forget, congressional testimony from Mark McGuire or any of those guys. We're not going to forget. That's part of the era they played in. And that's, even in voting for someone like Manny Ramirez, or if I voted for Alex Rodriguez, again, if they were suspended after baseball really came up with a way of policing the game after 2006 forward, ultimately, they're being suspended. They're losing playing time. They're not being allowed on the field. That hits their numbers. That hits their earning power. So, why am I supposed to then assess extra penalties for, again, players that I think were, some of the most significant and important players of their era? Whether you talk about David Ortiz, like getting caught before, or Manny Ramirez after, you want to put those guys in the Hall of Fame. They belong. They're really, again, they were the defining and tremendous players of the era. I think getting hung up on whether or not they were on one side of the line or the other, ultimately, these were about guys who were just trying to be excellent, trying to, be their best possible, selves. And whether or not, again, results do vary. Not everybody got a big benefit from using PEDs that we can see. When you go through the names of the Mitchell Report, you see a lot of pitchers and you see a lot of hitters like Adam Pyatt, like guys who did not amount to anything in the major leagues. So again, getting hung up on this, from my perspective, is more about sports writers almost avenging their own careers. The fact that they didn't make it a big deal in the 90s, they didn't make it a big deal until basically the owners started feeding them names, and they didn't report it at the time, at nearly the same volume that now suddenly people are upset about. And from my perspective, it's like, no, you don't have to do this. You can acknowledge, yeah, they use steroids. Now, sure, baseball did choose, and sports writers enabled, this kind of more confrontational approach to the subject of PEDs. The owners used performance-enhancing drugs as a brick bat to go after the players and run them down. Like when it was getting into, the collective bargaining agreements of the early '80s, baseball was still recovering from the ugliness of, Bud Selig shutting down the world, like canceling the World Series in 1994. the owners bringing in scabs in 1995. You can't talk about steroids and the way in which the conversation about steroids is changed as a result of owners using using investigations to attack the players and undermine their position. And if you're not remembering that, and you're not, allowing for the fact that, those guys who want to get those guys in the union, if you're not going to allow for the fact that that's a big part of their motivation, then you're not really getting into the full history of the game. Now, again, somebody in their wisdom, one of the committees, thought it made sense to put Bowie Kuhn in the Hall of Fame. Somebody, for whatever reason, thought it made sense to put Bud Selig in the Hall of Fame, even though he collapsed. I mean, again, this is a guy who is an owner, was one of the people involved with collusion, trying to undermine the competitive balance of the game in the 80s, and canceled the World Series, and it's just stupefying to me that, again, people have this concern over steroids, and it's like, this guy nearly, multiple times tried to destroy and damage the game, and we're upset about a guy using steroids and maybe getting a benefit and maybe not. Give me a break. It's about Cooperstown. It's about hallowing the game. We should be in the business of in the Hall of Fame and celebrating the game and its players. If we wind up in a situation where instead we're honoring, this is an institution that honors Bud Selig and keeps players out, I just see that as fundamentally problematic.
Christina Kahrl here on Sports Talk Chicago. Christina, when you look at the ballot, how many players do you consider to be a Hall of Famer? You've said in the past there have been at times 14, 16 people on a ballot who you consider Hall of Fame-esque. When you look at this ballot now, what's that number?
That number's at 15 for me, which makes it really tough to get down to 10, obviously. I mean, I hated getting down to 12, and so coming back down to 10, really was really very difficult. Last year, I made a point of making room for, some pretty, what I still think of as some pretty significant pitchers that, might be edge cases for most folks. But when you look at what Mark Burley or Tim Hudson, and, Andy Pettit's better than either of them. But I mean, all three of those guys are borderline for most voters. But I look at it as, you're talking about tremendous pitchers. You're talking about during the course of the history of the game, we're going to run up against a real problem with starting pitchers going forward, where representation of who are the top starters in their generation, that's going to be, after you get past, right now, Scherzer and Verlander, who else is there? Who's going to have enough counting stats, enough numbers? Who's going to last long enough to have a 3,000 inning pitch career? Not very many guys. And there aren't that many guys who can do that right now anyway in the first place on the ballot. So that's where I'm left with. Tim Hudson was a tremendous, the best pitcher of the Moneyball A's, the most durable, key component for competitive Braves teams, and also chipped in with the Giants at the end of his career. 20 game. I mean, he had an excellent career. Andy Pettit had a better career still. Mark Burley was again, tremendous athlete, tremendous fielder, but also, spun a perfect game and was remarkable. And again, a guy condemned to contribute to so many teams that weren't very good, but ended up having a superb career. It's kind of almost the latter-day Rick Russell for this generation in terms of a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, but it wasn't his fault. He happened to work for a team that wasn't reliably competitive. But because he doesn't have that, pizzazz of being associated with a great team, a lot of voters are just sort of Mark Burley. It's no, if you got to watch Mark Burley was awesome. But and he should be in the Hall of Fame. So that's where I look at, the fact that you have that group of pitchers who don't even crack most people's ballots, but they're crowding, the back end of my ballot like they did last year. And where do I wind up with them? And, ultimately, if we wind up in a situation where at a time when the game has 30 teams as opposed to 16, and is inducting fewer pitchers today and particularly fewer starting pitchers today than, like some of the mediocrities from the 20s and 30s who got, like thrown into the Hall of Fame, in the 50s and 60s, just because they were in a hurry to make sure that they put everybody associated with the 27 Yankees outside of the catchers, into the Hall. I mean, some of this is just sort of, from my perspective, not just about fairness, but it's about like, look, ultimately, if it's on the writers making people famous when you talk about fame, well, you should be making people like you should be in the business of making players like Mark Burley famous, because Mark Burley was incredible to watch play. And so, and if you can't do that, and you then say like, well, and he wasn't famous, well, that's about media, that's about narrative, that's about like, getting the story right. And if not enough people are paying attention to great players play, again, I'm not going to punish the players and as a voter because not enough people were trumpeting this guy is really something. But that's my attitude towards it, where it's like, the Hall should be in the business of hallowing, remembering, and treasuring great performance.
Is there anyone on your ballot last year who may drop off this year? Or vice versa, is there anybody you didn't have last year you might be thinking about adding this year?
Oh, it's so tough. I mean, like I've had Andrew Jones and Billy Wagner off and on my ballot, and I would love to have room for them in the same way that I would love to have room for Jeff Kent, and in the same way that I would love to have room for all three of the pitchers I just talked about. But you can't, because I mean, again, every year there's also the difficulty of new people being added. David Ortiz was an incredible player. I don't care that, again, one test result, defining player for so many of the great Red Sox teams that, not just broke the curse, but kind of, again, built something of a odd, peripatetic dynasty, during the aughties and early teens that, just a tremendous ball club, a performer that everybody recognized, respected, enjoyed, embraced. The notion that DHs are not a position, that it's been 40 years and almost 50 years now. It's ridiculous. Get over it. Ultimately, if we've got Harold Baines and Edgar Martinez and other players who played a significant portion of their career at DH in the Hall of Fame. I mean, Ted Simmons, for God's sake. I mean, which is great because Simba just obviously belonged in much sooner as like one of the great catchers of the 70s. But, like these are people who owe a significant portion of their career to the existence of the DH or their career to the DH. Just get over it. David Ortiz, how can you not talk about David Ortiz if you want to talk about baseball during the course of his career? So, that's where you got to make room for David Ortiz. What do you do with A-Rod? A-Rod's a new one as well. And so, there are people who are like, well, he's not a first ballot Hall of Famer because he did get caught. And but again, I'm beyond the people who, the people who still play that game as far as like, well, I don't want to contribute to a first ballot because that seems like I'm endorsing, but ultimately, yes, he's the Hall of Famer. It's like, okay, whatever, calculus you end up going through to basically justify it to yourself that you're not going to vote for him now, but you're going to vote for him later. Okay, whatever. Again, I'm like, if you gave me the space to vote for every Hall of Famer, I would. But again, that's where, we because then that would be a different mission. If your mission is to, if you expanded the ballot and said like, okay, name everybody you see out there who's a Hall of Famer, then as a voter, from my perspective, whether you keep the character clause or not, I would be obligated to name all 15 or 17 people that I think, might merit Hall of Fame inclusion. But that said, I believe in the big Hall. I believe the game is twice as big as it was, almost twice as big as it was, when they created the Hall of Fame. And, the standards having been set by previous precedents on top of consideration for, what truly is fame. I mean, again, I believe in a big Hall. I believe that, we can't forget about, great players in the 80s and 90s and into the present. I'm somebody who believes, we should be talking about Earl Hershiser. I'm somebody, I think we should be talking about Fernando Valenzuela. That, again, great players who truly were famous you got to put him in the Hall of Fame. I mean, Fernando's so famous, it's almost kind of ridiculous. It's like he brings too much fame to the Hall of Fame. Fernando Mania was amazing, not just for Mexican Americans, but just for what it was as a cultural moment in baseball history, but sports history. And so the fact that, like, we haven't even had a conversation about Fernando now for years, it's kind of ridiculous because it's like Fernando's big. He's a huge deal. Why are we not talking about it? Or Hershiser. The only reason the Dodgers win a World Series in 1988 with the most, improbable roster isn't because of Kurt Gibson hitting a home run of Dennis Eckersley, although that was direct. It's because Oral Hershiser threw the scoreless inning streak and was amazing. Was the most on pitcher in the history of on pitchers. Like 10 years from now, if we're arguing about Madison Bumgarner, how do the Giants win in 24? How do they win without Madison Bumgarner? They don't. They don't. I mean, again, that's like, some of these guys, if you're going to talk about putting the capital F in fame, they're guys who are not there yet, and they should be, because ultimately it's not just about the counting stats. It's ultimately about who defined or redefined baseball. And there are just tremendous players we should be talking about, and we're not. And that's unfortunate.
At this point, do you see anybody getting in this year?
I do think that Poppy is going to probably get in his first year. I'm not going to be surprised. I mean, it's going to be close, maybe. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if his first ballot is he's in the high 60s or something, and people say, okay, it's going to happen. But yeah, if I had to pick any one person who's definitely going in this year, I would say it's David Ortiz. I thought that, there would be enough people who would finally come around on Barry Bonds. I'd like to see that, but I don't know if we can count on that happening at this stage. I don't know. I don't know if we've gotten to that point in time where there's enough distance from it that enough people feel comfortable, or if they still want to just continue to sound off about how they feel about steroids and how they've essentially collaborated with owners. I feel immense frustration about that, but what you're going to do, people are going to vote the way they're going to vote. I don't think Schilling makes it. I think his asking people not to vote for him gave plenty of people all the excuse they needed to say, yeah, well, then I'm not gonna. Okay. And go to the era committees, and then the era committees will have a very interesting problem on their hand as far as whether or not they decide to grab that particular tiger by a tail. Not that he ever pitched for the Tigers, but it's going to be interesting whether or not they embrace that, because it's going to be a controversial moment if you put Curt Schilling behind a podium, and what's he going to say? But as an institution, I totally although I have not voted for Curt Schilling, I do respect everyone who makes a choice to vote for him. That's their call, their ballot, and I'm not going to disagree with that. I think the case is strong, but in the same way that I see a Hall of Famer when I look at Andy Pettitte or Tim Hudson, if I had an open ballot for no end of spaces, then I wouldn't have the opportunity to say well, I need to also make room for these guys because I'm limited to 10. I get to make those choices, but every voter does, and that's why I don't really have an issue with people who make active choices to vote for someone, as opposed to people who are, I don't have a problem with people who basically end up supporting it. I understand the reasons why. I don't necessarily understand the reasons why behind Omar Vizquel, but setting aside all of the horrible stuff we found out about him in the last year, I don't understand how anybody looks at Omar Vizquel and Jimmy Rollins and picks Omar Vizquel, because Jimmy Rollins was the best shortstop in baseball from 2001 to 2000, basically his run with the Phillies. He's if you total up WAR alone, and WAR is an imperfect stat, but a good sorting tool and kind of aggregation of value to give you at least a general idea of how good a guy was relative to his peers. And then you can start parsing and getting really more into the weeds. But Jimmy Rollins is number one in WAR among Major League Baseball shortstops from 2001 to 2014. He is one of the two players basically that give you that great Phillies team that won 5 straight NL Easts and won a couple of pennants and won the World Series in 2009. if Jimmy Rollins and Chase Utley aren't on that team, they don't win those. They don't do any of that. And Jimmy Rollins' durability, his defense, his speed, and his power, all of that combined. And he was just flat out fun to watch play. So it's like you add all of that up, and it's like, why are we not talking about Jimmy Rollins? Omar Vizquel, how many amazing memories of Omar Vizquel do I have compared to Jimmy Rollins? It's not even close. I mean, like Omar Vizquel aggregated a large number of counting stats. And that's, like again, respect to his ability to make contact, his defensive value, all of that. I'm not saying he's not a valuable player, but again, I look at, Jimmy Rollins won an MVP for a reason, because he was that important and that, dynamic a player. Omar Vizquel was really good for a long time. And so, that's where you get into, why would I pick one over the other? Well, Jimmy Rollins made a huge difference. Omar Vizquel contributed to a number of good teams, but Jimmy Rollins is a reason you win by himself. And that, for me, when you look at everything that he did, it's just kind of, I hope he doesn't fall. I mean, that's, if there's one guy to anticipate a question, if you ask it, guys who will fall below 5% and shouldn't on this year, I'm worried about Jimmy Rollins perhaps more than anybody, just because I think it's a crowded ballot, and the number of people who are going to say like, well, he didn't do this, or, he didn't have these counting stats. And it's like, no, when you look at the body of work, Jimmy Rollins was the best shortstop of his era. And, like better than Miguel Tejada, better, like during the years that he was an everyday player than Derek Jeter. So why aren't we talking more about Jimmy Rollins? And it's like, well, like the Phillies dynasty wasn't as big as the Yankees dynasty, or as long, or win as many titles. And it's like, yeah, well, it's a competitive dynamic, like there was a lot of competitive balance in the oddies and early teens. And, like you had a lot of teams in with potential to win, and the Phillies were one of them. And again, where I get back to, Jimmy Rollins is a big part of that reason. And you gotta respect that. But that's me. I hope he doesn't drop off. I hope he doesn't wind up like Lou Whitaker and just fall off one and done, or Kenny Lofton or Jim Edmonds. And it's like, all great players who I would put in the Hall of Fame, because like I said, big Hall believer. But it's just ridiculous that, again, some of the most important, particularly up the middle players of their era are basically getting overlooked.
Christina Kahrl still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Christina, two more questions before we finish up. First off, your reaction to Minnie Minoso getting in was one.
Relief, joy. It's so overdue. And I know this for me, I mean, like, again, I had the privilege of being the last person to interview Minnie while he was alive. And I know the family, and being able to talk to Charlie Minoso, his youngest son, that day that we finally got both the day that his father passed, but then, like, just a couple of weeks ago, with the news that his father finally made it in. I know Minnie was in that last interview very upfront about how much he wanted to go in while he was alive, that he was exasperated that he had been made to wait as long as he already had. It's, again, one of those ludicrous oversights that, like one of the three best players in the American League from the so-called golden era from the 50s, that he was not already in. The guy that, like, obviously somebody has to be third best behind like Mantle and Ted Williams in the American League in the 50s. But that was Minnie Minoso, who was also the Jackie Robinson of Latin America, who was also, just, and again, those White Sox and Indians teams that he played on so often finished second to the Yankees. Well, okay, fine. But you know what? Again, they made a good run. They made the Yankees play for it. So, and a big part of the reason why was Minoso. So the fact that he's finally gotten the respect he long deserved. The idea that he also gets to go in with Tony Oliva is a big deal from my perspective. He was outspoken about how Latin American players had been shorted by the Hall of Fame's process, that Tony was one of those players. Luis Tiant, it would have been wonderful if he had gotten in as well this time around. I mean, El Tiante is still with us. He could still get in. I still hope he gets in. It's certainly overdue for him as well. But I know he would have been happy knowing that he got in the same year as Tony. I just wish it had been 5 years ago.
Before we finish up today, last question. Why does Keith Olbermann always hate your Hall of Fame ballots?
Oh, I honestly don't know. I mean, he was the person. He was speculating that I would drop Derek Jeter for that I would be the person who didn't vote for Derek Jeter or Mariano Rivera on their first. And like, no, that's where, again, I've for whatever reason, the people who want to still avenge their childhoods, whether it's like, the boomers who are, still treasuring the players of the 50s and 60s, and don't really care about like the 80s and 90s. I don't know. I find it a little silly. I find it a little sad the way some people get angry and bent out of shape about this. But ultimately, I guess I look at the Hall of Fame and the vote process of voting for the Hall of Fame. It's fun. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be about recalling and celebrating, players who were, again, have given us so much joy on the field. And why can't we remember that when we look at what they've been able to do? Ann Killian wrote a great column today in the column or for the San Francisco Chronicle of getting into why she didn't vote this year. And a big part about it is the level of anger, envy, spite, vindictiveness, call it what you will, but that the amount of vitriol around this conversation. And that's where, it's an unfortunate sign of the times. Keith Olbermann contributes to that by doing what he does and how he chooses to talk about this. But that's where I would respect Keith. I respect Keith's opinions on the subject of baseball, but I don't make it personal, I guess, is really what it boils down to. Where I think, again, I think that baseball should, as a matter of fact, just embrace that the game is bigger and needs to celebrate everybody. And he looks at the Hall of Fame perhaps and sees it as I shouldn't even characterize Keith's comments, but just where I find them interesting. But I don't understand why he's convinced I've got it out for the Yankees. I don't understand why he thinks I wasn't going to vote for Derek Jeter or Mariano Rivera. But hey, again, that's where I respect great Yankee. I mean, I'm voting for Andy Pettitte, and I clearly don't have it out for the Yankees. I think Jorge Posada and Bernie Williams are people we should be talking about, or again, guys who are short, maybe did not get as much consideration from the process as this said. So I don't have a bias against the East Coast because I'm here on the Best Coast, but that. I don't want to say I'm biased, but that's where I guess Keith is looking for reasons to get angry, and he does not run out of them.
Well, Christina, thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to have you on. Best wishes at the San Francisco Chronicle, and hopefully there isn't too much hatred around your ballot when it comes out next week. Thank you so much.
Oh, we'll see. Thank you, John. Definitely a pleasure.